Hello viewers, welcome to the channel Amazing Civil Engineering Studies. Time to enter the world of civil engineering. Here we will learn about different concepts related to civil engineering. Please subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon for more new updates. In today's video we are going to discuss about railway gauges. Types of railway gauges. Gauge is the measure of distance between the railroad rails. The distance is usually measured from the inside top edge of the parallel rails. That is, the distance between the two tracks on any railway route is known as railway gauge. Approximately 60% of the world's railway uses standard gauge of 1,435 mm. There are four types of railway gauge used in India: broad gauge, meter gauge, narrow gauge and standard gauge, for Delhi Metro. Following are the factors affecting the choice of a gauge. 1. Traffic condition. If the intensity of traffic on the track is likely to be more, a gauge wider than the standard gauge is suitable. 2. Development of poor areas. The narrow gauges are laid in certain parts of the world to develop a poor area and thus link the poor area with the outside developed world. Cost of track. The cost of railway track is directly proportional to the width of its gauge. If the fund available is not sufficient to construct a standard gauge, a meter gauge or a narrow gauge is preferred rather than to have no railways at all. Speed of movement. The speed of a train is a function of the diameter of wheel, which in turn is limited by the gauge. The wheel diameter is usually about 0.75 times the gauge width, and thus, the speed of a train is almost proportional to the gauge. If higher speeds are to be attained, the B.C track is preferred to the M.G track. Nature of country. In mountainous country, it is advisable to have a narrow gauge of the track since it is more flexible and can be laid to a smaller radius on the curves. This is the main reason why some important railways, covering thousands of kilometers, are laid with a gauge as narrow as 610 mm. There are four types of railway gauge used in India: broad gauge, meter gauge, narrow gauge and standard gauge, for Delhi Metro. Broad gauge. Broad gauge is also called wide gauge or large line. The distance between the two tracks in these railway gauges is 1,676 mm, 5 fet 6 in. It would not be wrong to say that any gauge, wider than standard gauge or 1,435 mm, 4 fet 8 1/2 inches, is called broad gauge. The first railway line built in India was a broad gauge line from Porbandar, now Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, to Thane in 1853. Broad gauge railway is also used on ports for crane etc. This gives better stability and they are even better than thinner gauges. The broad gauge line is the most widely used in India with approximately 108,500 kilometers, 67,400 miles, of track length and 60,430 kilometers, 37,549 miles, of route length in 2016. It is also called Indian gauge and is the broadest gauge in operation in the world. Meter gauge. The distance between the two tracks is 1000 mm, 3 inches. The meter gauge lines were made to reduce the cost. All meter gauge lines except the Nilgiri Mountain Railway, which is a legacy run on a meter gauge in India, will be converted into broad gauge under Project Uni Gauge. 1000 mm, 3 feet 3 inches. Meter gauge, mg. Narrow gauge. The small gauge is called a narrow gauge or a small line. The narrow gauge railway is the railway track, in which distance between two tracks is 2 feet 6 in, 762 mm, and 2 feet, 610 mm. In 2015, there was a 1,500 km narrow gauge rail route, which is considered to be about 2% of the total Indian rail network. As the country is developing, small line services are expected to be completed by 2018. Now the small lines are being converted into big lines. Trains with small bogies now will no longer be able to see much. The Darjeeling Mountain Railway has declared UNESCO World Heritage on July 24, 2008. Kakas-Shimla Railway is also very popular. Narrow gauge 2 feet 6 in, 762 mm, and 2 feet, 610 mm. Standard gauge. Standard gauge probably in many countries of the world is 1435 mm. This measurement was developed by George Stephenson, a British railway engineer, using the width of coal wagons that were in use before the invention of the steam locomotive. In the United States, gauge can vary slightly between 4 feet, 8.5 inches to 4 feet, 9.5 inches, 1,460 millimeters. All rail cars and locomotives built to this specification can use any standard gauge railroad line in the world. However, not all railroads have been built to standard gauge. A standard gauge railway is a railway with a track gauge of 1,435 mm, 4 feet or 81/2 inches. Thanks for watching. For now, please subscribe, like, share and do not forget to press bell icon.